We think we know the face of evil. We imagine it cloaked in shadow, a figure from a nightmare. But the terrifying truth is that evil in America often wears a familiar smile, lives next door, drives a regular car, and walks among us unseen. For decades, the shadows of the American dream have been stalked by monsters, men and sometimes women who have defined the very word serial killer. These aren't just criminals, they are voids in the shape of humans, leaving behind trails of devastation that stretch across state lines and haunt generations. Tonight, we journey into the darkest chapters of American true crime, not to glorify the acts, but to understand the mechanisms of terror, the failures that allowed them to flourish, and the enduring legacy of the nation's most dangerous predators. This is a look into the broken psyche, the meticulous planning, and the sheer, chilling indifference to human life that allowed them to become the stuff of legend and fear. Prepare yourself, because the stories we are about to tell define the line between civilization and chaos. Our journey begins in the 1970s, a decade often romanticized in American culture, but one that also birthed an era of unprecedented fear. The rise of the highway system and increasing anonymity in cities created a perfect hunting ground. The name Ted Bundy is synonymous with this era, a man who became the archetype of the charismatic killer. Born Theodore Robert Cowell in 1946, Bundy was, by all accounts, a promising young man. He was charming, articulate, studying law, and even worked for a time at a suicide crisis line, a detail that now stands as a chilling irony. He possessed the social camouflage of a political hopeful or a rising executive, a stark contrast to the brutal reality of his inner life. Bundy's killing spree began in the Pacific Northwest in the early 1970s. His victims were overwhelmingly young women, often college students, whom he approached by feigning injury, impersonating a police officer, or simply using his deceptive charm. His methods involved elaborate ruses designed to lure his targets into a vulnerable position. At Lake Sammamish State Park in Washington in 1974, he approached multiple women in broad daylight, wearing a sling and asking for help carrying a sailboat onto his car. 2 women vanished that day, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, in one of the most brazen displays of his predatory confidence. What made Bundy uniquely dangerous was his ability to adapt and blend. He wasn't tied to one location or one method. He moved from Washington to Utah, then to Colorado, leaving a trail of missing women in his wake. In Utah, he enrolled at the University of Utah Law School, using his studies as yet another layer of respectability. It was in Utah that he committed some of his most violent and confusing attacks, often relying on abductions and then disposing of the bodies in remote, often mountainous areas, making recovery and forensic analysis nearly impossible at the time. His first arrest came in 1975 in Utah. A state trooper pulled him over and found a variety of suspicious items in his car: a ski mask, a crowbar, rope, handcuffs, and various items of clothing. He was initially charged with aggravated kidnapping. It was during his eventual trial in Colorado for the murder of Karen Campbell that the public began to grasp the true horror of his nature. Bundy, insisting on representing himself, used his law background to manipulate the proceedings, often engaging in courtroom theatrics. This seemingly minor concession allowed him an opportunity he would later exploit. In 1977, while awaiting trial in Aspen, Colorado, Bundy made his first escape. He jumped from a second-story window of the courthouse library. He was captured just 8 days later. But the audacity of his crimes was matched only by the audacity of his escapes. His second and most consequential escape occurred later that year from the Garfield County Jail. He managed to chip away at the ceiling of his cell over a period of weeks, losing a significant amount of weight to squeeze through the opening into the ventilation system. Once free, he stole a car and drove across the country, eventually landing in the state of Florida, a place where his identity was unknown and his crimes, for a short time, unlinked to the horrors of the West. This escape led to one of the most brutal and defining moments of his criminal career, the attack at the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee on January 15, 1978. In a terrifying early morning invasion, Bundy bludgeoned 4 young women, murdering 2, Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, and severely injuring 2 others. Then he broke into a nearby house and attacked another student, Cheryl Thomas. The sheer violence and invasion of a seemingly safe space sent shockwaves through the campus and the nation. Bundy was finally caught for good just weeks later after being pulled over by a police officer in Pensacola. His eventual trial in Miami for the Chi Omega attacks was the first to be nationally televised, cementing his place in the public consciousness. He was, as prosecutor Larry Simpson described him, the embodiment of malignant narcissism. The trial saw breakthrough forensic evidence, including bite marks left on the body of Lisa Levy, which definitively linked Bundy to the crime scene. He received 3 death sentences. Bundy's story is a foundational case for understanding modern serial murder. It highlighted the dangers of charm as a weapon, the limitations of interstate law enforcement coordination at the time, and the disturbing phenomenon of the mask of sanity. Before his execution in 1989, Bundy confessed to 30 murders, though the true count is widely believed to be higher. His victims were not random. They were chosen for the opportunity they presented, and his success lay in the way he subverted trust. The legacy of Ted Bundy is a persistent shadow, a warning that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who appear the most human. As the Bundy frenzy subsided, another, equally terrifying figure began to dominate the headlines, operating with a different, more localized terror, yet leaving behind a psychological devastation that defined Los Angeles in the 1980s. This was Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Where Bundy was calculated and used deception, Ramirez was pure, chaotic, and terrifying violence, often fueled by drug abuse and a disturbing fixation on Satanism. His reign of terror spanned from 1984 to 1985, primarily in the areas of Los Angeles and San Francisco. His method was brutal. He would enter homes in the dead of night through unlocked doors or windows, surprising residents while they slept. His victims were diverse, ranging from a 9-year-old girl to a 79-year-old woman, defying the typical pattern of a serial killer focused on a narrow demographic. This randomness added to the public panic, as no one felt safe. Anyone, anywhere, could be next. His first confirmed murder was a 9-year-old girl, Mei Lung, in San Francisco in 1984. However, his spree became front-page news in the summer of 1985 in Los Angeles. He would attack couples, demanding money and jewelry before sexually assaulting and murdering them. He used a variety of weapons, guns, knives, hammers, further confusing investigators who were initially looking for a killer with a consistent modus operandi. The randomness of the attacks was a deliberate tactic of terror. He didn't just kill, he violated the sanctity of the home, leaving behind a chilling calling card, a pentagram drawn on the walls, or even on the victims themselves. This apparent satanic ritualism was a key part of the persona he cultivated, a persona that both fascinated and repulsed the public. He was a symbol of pure, unadulterated evil. The psychological toll on Southern California was immense. Hardware stores sold out of every kind of locking mechanism. People who had never owned guns bought them. Residents slept with the lights on, huddled together, terrified to leave their windows open even during the scorching summer heat. The police department and the media struggled to manage the deluge of false alarms and genuine tips. The pressure on law enforcement was extreme.
The breakthrough in the case came not through complex detective work, but through a simple vehicle violation. A survivor of one of the attacks was able to give a description of a car seen near the scene. When the car was eventually recovered, it yielded a single crucial fingerprint that led to the identification of Richard Ramirez. The police released his mugshot to the press, identifying him as the Night Stalker. The public reaction to the revelation of his identity was instantaneous and dramatic. On August 31, 1985, an unsuspecting Ramirez, riding a bus back to Los Angeles from Arizona, saw his own face plastered on the front page of a newspaper. He immediately fled the bus, and what followed was a rare moment of citizen intervention. Residents in an East Los Angeles neighborhood recognized him and chased him down, surrounding him until the police could arrive. The community, terrified for months, delivered the monster into the hands of justice. The trial of Richard Ramirez was a spectacle. He often showed up in court wearing sunglasses and flashing a hand-drawn pentagram on his palm. He seemed to relish the attention and the notoriety. In 1989, he was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death. When the verdicts were read, he offered a chilling response. "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." Ramirez died on death row in 2013 from complications related to B-cell lymphoma, having successfully managed to avoid execution for decades. The Night Stalker is a critical figure because he represents the chaotic, truly random violence that shatters the sense of security in large urban environments. Unlike Bundy, who sought control and manipulation, Ramirez sought destruction and terror for its own sake. He left behind a cultural scar on Los Angeles, forever changing how people viewed the safety of their own homes and the vulnerability of the night. The story shifts again, from the charismatic facade and the satanic chaos to a methodical, deeply complex, and frustratingly elusive figure who would terrorize the working-class suburbs of Wichita, Kansas, over a period spanning 3 decades. This is the story of Dennis Rader, known to the world as BTK, Bind, Torture, Kill. The length of time Rader operated and the shocking normalcy of his life make him one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Rader was a husband, a father of 2, a church council president, a Cub Scout leader, and for a time a compliance officer in the very community where he committed his unspeakable acts. His life was the epitome of Midwestern conventionality, a mask worn with perfection. This ability to integrate and maintain a double life for over 30 years is perhaps the most frightening element of the BTK case. His first known murders occurred in 1974 when he broke into the Otero family home. He murdered Joseph, Julie, and their 2 young children, Josephine and Joseph Jr., setting the stage for his moniker. The acts were brutal and personal, driven by a deep-seated desire for domination and control. Following the Otero murders, Rader began a campaign of terror by communicating directly with the media and law enforcement. He began signing his letters BTK, thus christening himself. This desire for recognition and control over his own narrative was a key psychological driver. He wanted credit for his work, viewing his victims not as people, but as props in his perverse secret life. He struck again in 1974, killing Catherine Bright. Then there was a lull before his next known victim, Shirley Vine, in 1977, and another, Nancy Fox, later that year. Each crime was carefully planned, and each victim was subjected to the horrific ritual of being bound, tortured, and killed. The BTK case went cold for years. Rader was living his life, raising his family, working his jobs, all while the police hunted a phantom. The public fear, however, never completely vanished, lurking just beneath the surface of Wichita life.
It wasn't until 1985 with the murder of Maureen Hedge and then 1991 with the murder of Dolores Davis that BTK resurfaced, only to retreat again into the camouflage of his ordinary existence. The case remained cold for 13 years until 2004, when Rader, driven by the same narcissistic need for attention that defined his early career, decided to re-establish contact. This contact proved to be his undoing. He sent a series of communications to the media, including an unusual request to law enforcement. He asked if a floppy disk could be traced. The police, sensing their chance, instructed him through a coded newspaper ad that it would be safe to send. In 2005, Rader sent a purple 1.44 megabyte floppy disk to a Wichita TV station. Investigators immediately and easily traced the disk's metadata to the Christ Lutheran Church, where Rader was the council president. Further forensic work linked the disk to a computer used by Rader. They also covertly obtained a pap smear specimen from his daughter at a medical clinic, which provided DNA evidence. The DNA confirmed the worst fears of the community. Dennis Rader, the friendly compliance officer, the pillar of the church, was the monster they had been hunting for 30 years. His capture and subsequent confession were stunning. Rader detailed his crimes in a chillingly flat, bureaucratic voice, describing the binding and torturing with the same tone one might use to discuss yard work. His capture closed one of the longest and most frustrating serial killer investigations in American history. The case of BTK serves as a chilling testament to the power of the killer's mask and the terrifying fact that the most monstrous individuals can exist undetected within the very fabric of society. From the charismatic killer to the chaotic monster and the suburban sociopath, these stories paint a complex and terrifying picture of American violence. The next chapter of our investigation will focus on the killers whose crimes were defined by a high victim count and a methodical approach to targeting the most vulnerable in society. From the charismatic killer to the chaotic monster and the suburban sociopath, these stories paint a complex and terrifying picture of American violence. The next chapter of our investigation will focus on the killers whose crimes were defined by high victim counts and a methodical approach to targeting the most vulnerable in society. We turn our attention now to the Pacific Northwest, to the case of Gary Ridgway, the notorious Green River Killer, a man whose apathy towards human life made him responsible for one of the highest victim tolls in American history. Gary Ridgway operated primarily in Washington state during the 1980s and 1990s. His known victim count stands at 49, though he confessed to strangling dozens more. His targets were almost exclusively young women who were sex workers or runaways, individuals often marginalized and less likely to be immediately reported missing or receive sustained investigative attention. This demographic vulnerability was a deliberate choice by Ridgway, maximizing his opportunities while minimizing his risk of detection. Ridgway was a seemingly ordinary man, a longtime truck painter who lived an unremarkable life in a typical suburban home. Like Dennis Rader, he used his ordinariness as his shield. He was questioned several times during the initial investigation into the string of murders in the early 1980s, which were named after the Green River, where the first bodies were discovered. Yet lacking conclusive evidence, he was repeatedly released. The frustration of the task force dedicated to the case, known as the Green River Task Force, became a defining struggle for decades. The height of Ridgway's activity was the early to mid-1980s. Bodies were discovered along the Green River, then later scattered throughout wooded areas in King County. The sheer volume of victims and the consistent method of strangulation, followed by the careful, often hidden disposal of the bodies, suggested a highly organized and prolific killer. The investigation was massive, one of the most extensive in U.S. history, but for years the trail ran cold.
The investigation was plagued by the lack of advanced forensic technology available at the time, particularly DNA analysis. However, the work done by the task force in collecting and meticulously preserving evidence would ultimately be the key to solving the case years later. In the late 1990s, new advances in DNA testing allowed investigators to re-examine evidence collected from early victims. Specifically, they were able to extract a DNA profile from seminal fluid found on the bodies of 3 of the victims, connecting the murders unequivocally. This breakthrough confirmed they were dealing with a single perpetrator. In 2001, detectives matched the DNA profile to a sample Gary Ridgway had given during a previous unrelated investigation. After decades of surveillance, suspicion, and frustration, the Green River Killer had a name. Ridgway was arrested at his workplace. Facing the death penalty, Ridgway chose to cooperate with prosecutors. He confessed to 48 murders, leading investigators to the remains of several missing women. This cooperation was a desperate bargain. In exchange for revealing the locations of his victims, he was spared execution and instead received a life sentence in prison without parole. For the victims' families, this deal, while painful, offered the closure of knowing their loved ones' resting places. During his confession, Ridgway offered chilling insight into his motives. He said he chose sex workers because he believed they were easy targets and he enjoyed making them feel powerless. His lack of empathy was profound. He expressed no remorse, only a logistical accounting of his crimes. His high victim count is a brutal reminder of the societal cost of ignoring and marginalizing vulnerable populations. The case of the Green River Killer fundamentally changed the way law enforcement approaches missing persons, particularly those in high-risk categories, underscoring the urgent need for comprehensive DNA databases and cross-jurisdictional collaboration. While Ridgway terrorized the Pacific Northwest, another predator was exploiting a different type of vulnerability in California, preying on young men and boys who were often hitchhiking or involved in transient activities. This was John Wayne Gacy, known as the Killer Clown, a figure whose public persona and private depravity offered a grotesque contrast. John Wayne Gacy was an active member of his community in suburban Chicago. He ran a successful construction contracting business, volunteered at political events, and frequently dressed up as Pogo the Clown to entertain children at parties and charity functions. This public image of a respected businessman and family friend provided him with the perfect cover for his horrific private life. Gacy's murder spree began in the early 1970s and continued until his arrest in 1978. His victims were young men and boys, many of whom were lured to his home with promises of construction work or money. Once there, he would overpower, sexually assault, and then strangle them. His method of disposal was perhaps the most shocking part of his crimes. He buried most of the bodies in the crawl space beneath his house. The investigation into Gacy began in earnest after the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest in December 1978. Piest had told his mother he was going to meet Gacy about a potential job. When Piest failed to return, investigators focused quickly on Gacy. During their initial search of Gacy's home, police noticed a pervasive, sickly sweet odor, the unmistakable smell of decomposition masked by air fresheners and lime. Following intense pressure, Gacy began cooperating with authorities, leading them to the horrific truth. The ensuing excavation of his home yielded the remains of 29 victims buried beneath the floorboards and in the foundation of the home. 4 additional bodies were later recovered from the Des Plaines River. In total, Gacy was responsible for the murders of 33 young males. The discovery sent shockwaves across the nation, not just because of the sheer number of victims, but because of the meticulous effort Gacy took to hide them literally under the noses of his neighbors and his own family. The suburban ranch house, a symbol of the American dream, had become a mass grave.
Gacy's trial in 1980 was highly publicized. The defense attempted to argue that he was insane, but the prosecution successfully painted a portrait of a calculated, manipulative killer who consciously chose his victims. Gacy was convicted of 33 murders and sentenced to death. His execution by lethal injection occurred in 1994. The case of John Wayne Gacy is a chilling illustration of the concept of the organized serial killer, a predator who maintains a high-functioning public life, meticulously plans his crimes, and controls the disposition of evidence. It also created a profound and lasting cultural fear surrounding the idea of the trusted, friendly public figure concealing a monstrous secret. The fear of a stranger lurking in the dark is an old one, but the next killer we examine redefined that fear, turning routine travel into a deadly risk. We now explore the case of Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee cannibal, a man whose crimes involved not only murder, but also sexual deviance, dismemberment, and necrophilia, making his case one of the most psychologically disturbing in criminal history. Jeffrey Dahmer was active from 1978 to 1991, committing the majority of his 17 murders in the Milwaukee, Wisconsin area. His victims were almost entirely men, often young men of color, whom he would pick up at gay bars or public spaces and lure back to his apartment with promises of money or photographs. Dahmer's methodology was driven by an intense desire for total control and ownership of his victims. He experimented with using drugs to sedate them, hoping to create a kind of zombie-like companion. When this failed, his crimes escalated to murder, dismemberment, and horrifyingly, acts of necrophilia and cannibalism. He kept mementos, including skulls, preserved body parts, and photographs, documenting his atrocities within his small apartment. Unlike Gacy or Bundy, Dahmer was often shy and reserved, lacking the overt charm that defined his contemporaries. His crimes were highly solitary, occurring almost entirely within the confines of his apartment. This isolation allowed his dark fantasies to escalate unchecked for over a decade. His ability to operate for so long was due, in part, to the systemic neglect of his victims' disappearances. When his victims were often marginalized or transient, reports of their absence were frequently given less weight by authorities. The horrific extent of Dahmer's crimes was finally exposed on July 22, 1991. One of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape from Dahmer's apartment and flagged down 2 police officers. Edwards led the officers back to Dahmer's apartment, where they were confronted with a scene of absolute horror. Polaroid photos detailing the stages of his crimes, skulls in the closet, and human remains stored in the refrigerator and freezer. The discovery sent shockwaves across the globe. The trial raised difficult questions about the nature of evil, mental illness, and systemic bias in policing. Dahmer was diagnosed with several personality disorders, but was found legally sane, as the prosecution argued he was capable of controlling his impulses. He was convicted of 15 counts of murder and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms. Dahmer's time in prison was brief. In 1994, he was murdered by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver. The Dahmer case remains a horrifying benchmark, forcing society to confront the darkest extremes of human pathology and the critical need for law enforcement to treat all missing persons cases with equal diligence, regardless of the victim's background. As we move past the age of the prolific high-count killers, the focus shifts to those whose crimes were less about quantity and more about the psychological torment inflicted on the victims and the communities they targeted. The nature of the hunt evolves, becoming less about concealment and more about a cruel game played with law enforcement and the public.
As we move past the age of the prolific high-count killers, the focus shifts to those whose crimes were less about quantity and more about the psychological torment inflicted on the victims and the communities they targeted. The nature of the hunt evolves, becoming less about concealment and more about a cruel game played with law enforcement and the public. This evolution brings us to the case of Zodiac, an anonymous killer who terrorized Northern California in the late 1960s and early 1970s, whose true identity remains one of America's most enduring mysteries. Unlike the killers we have discussed so far, Zodiac's fame rests on his communications and his elusiveness, not his capture. His confirmed victim count is relatively low, 5 people killed and 2 injured, but he claimed to have murdered as many as 37. The terror he inflicted was amplified by his direct and mocking engagement with the media and the police. Zodiac's first confirmed attack took place in December 1968, when a high school couple, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, were shot and killed in a secluded area near Vallejo, California. The pattern of attacks continued into 1969, escalating the tension across the San Francisco Bay Area. In July 1969, he attacked another couple, Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau, in a parking lot. Ferrin was killed, but Mageau survived and provided a description of the killer. What set the Zodiac apart was his campaign of letters sent to major newspapers, including the San Francisco Chronicle, the Vallejo Times-Herald, and the San Francisco Examiner. These letters detailed his crimes, often included pieces of the victim's clothing as proof, and, most famously, contained 4 intricate, highly complex ciphers. He demanded that the papers publish the ciphers, threatening more killings if they refused. The first cipher, an 8-part message, was cracked shortly after publication by a school teacher and his wife. The decoded message, however, did not reveal the killer's identity, but rather a rambling, self-aggrandizing statement about his motivation. He claimed that the murders were a necessity, stating, "I like killing people because it is so much fun." Zodiac's arrogance reached a peak in October 1969 when he murdered cab driver Paul Stein in the Presidio Heights neighborhood of San Francisco. This attack was significant because it occurred in a densely populated urban area, and witnesses saw the killer walking away, providing a crucial, though ultimately inconclusive, composite sketch. This murder was also followed by more correspondence, including a piece of Stein's shirt, confirming the killer's involvement. The letters continued through the early 1970s, often filled with dark humor, threats, and further cryptic symbols. These communications effectively turned the investigation into a psychological chess match between the killer and the police, all played out in the public eye. The psychological impact on the Bay Area was profound. People stopped going out at night, especially young couples, and the sight of a person in a homemade hood, which Zodiac had once worn during an attack, became a symbol of dread. As the years passed, the letters became less frequent and the attacks ceased, but the mystery deepened. The police departments in multiple jurisdictions struggled to coordinate, and the physical evidence, though plentiful, was never sufficient to definitively name a suspect. Many individuals have been considered over the decades, but none have been conclusively proven to be the Zodiac. The Zodiac case highlights a unique form of danger, the terror imposed not just by the act of murder, but the ongoing public psychological manipulation. It showcases the limitations of law enforcement when faced with an intelligent, media-savvy criminal who prioritized anonymity and control over his own narrative. The killer's ability to retreat into the shadows has ensured his permanent place in the pantheon of America's most dangerous, not because of the number of his victims, but because of the enduring, unsettling knowledge that he was never caught and may have continued to live among his victims. Moving eastward and forward in time, the dangers posed by serial killers took on a new dimension, crossing state lines and exploiting the transient nature of modern life.
We examine the story of Samuel Little, officially designated by the FBI as the most prolific serial killer in American history, whose lengthy career of violence targeted women on the fringes of society across multiple states over 50 years. Samuel Little's murderous career spanned from 1970 to 2005. Unlike the flamboyant showmen or the methodical planners, Little was an opportunistic wanderer who crisscrossed the country, often seeking out victims in poverty-stricken areas in places like Florida, California, and Texas. For years, Little's crimes went unnoticed, or at least unlinked. His victims were primarily marginalized women, sex workers, drug users, and others struggling with addiction or poverty. They were the people society often overlooks, and their murders were frequently attributed to drug overdoses, accidents, or internal community violence. His method was consistent. He would punch or strangle his victims, often leaving no definitive stab or gunshot wounds, making the cause of death difficult to determine without detailed forensic work. Little was arrested countless times over the decades for petty crimes like shoplifting, assault, and drug possession, but his connection to the numerous unsolved murders was never established. His anonymity was his greatest weapon. He was a ghost in the system. The breakthrough in the Little case did not come from a recent crime, but from a painstaking effort to clear cold cases decades later. Little was arrested in Kentucky in 2012 on a narcotics charge and extradited to California on an unrelated charge. While in jail, investigators from the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, or VCAP, began to connect the dots. A cold case detective linked his DNA to 3 unsolved murders in Los Angeles from the late 1980s. Once confronted with the evidence, Little began to confess. His memory for the details of the murders was astonishingly clear, even decades later. He began drawing portraits of his victims from memory and describing where and how he had killed them, often recounting the time and place of the crime, providing invaluable information to detectives across the country. The scope of his crimes was staggering. Little confessed to 93 murders across 19 states. The FBI officially verified 60 of these confessions, confirming that Samuel Little is statistically the most prolific known killer in American history. The confirmed victim count continues to grow as new cases are matched to his detailed, often chilling accounts.
Little's case exposes the hidden landscape of serial murder in America, particularly the vulnerability of those whose disappearance goes unremarked. His ability to operate successfully for so long was a function of both the transient nature of his life and the systemic invisibility of his victims. He passed away in prison in 2020 at the age of 80, but the process of identifying his victims and bringing closure to those families continues to this day. The investigation into Samuel Little is a testament to the persistent dedication of cold case detectives and the critical importance of national law enforcement databases in connecting crimes across vast geographic distances. The anonymity of the road and the vulnerability of the traveler have long been a haunting ground. Our final deep dive in this chapter focuses on another geographically diverse killer who terrorized young women across the Southeast and Midwest, a man who also managed to integrate himself, albeit briefly, into the very system designed to stop him. We look now at Danny Rolling, the Gainesville Ripper. Danny Rolling's reign of terror culminated in August 1990 in Gainesville, Florida, near the University of Florida campus. He murdered 5 college students over 4 days, creating an environment of profound, paralyzing fear that caused the university to essentially shut down. Rolling's methods were characterized by extreme violence and staging. He would break into off-campus apartments, overpowering and sexually assaulting his victims before stabbing and mutilating them. He often repositioned the bodies and left them in staged poses, revealing a disturbed mind driven by sexual sadism and a desire for theatrical display. The victims, Sonia Larson, Christina Powell, Krista Hoyt, Manuel Taboada, and Tracy Powells, were found in separate incidents, but the similarities in the method and the gruesome staging quickly led authorities to realize they were facing a serial killer. The panic that swept through Gainesville was instant and absolute. Students armed themselves, moved out of their apartments en masse, and classes were largely abandoned. The city, normally vibrant with student life, became a ghost town. Rolling, a drifter with a long history of petty crime and violence, had been hiding in the woods surrounding the campus. Ironically, just before the murders, he had been camping near the campus and had a minor run-in with police, but he managed to evade further scrutiny. The investigation was massive and complex, involving hundreds of police officers and agents. Initially, authorities wrongly focused on a student, leading to intense public pressure and misdirection. The case broke when DNA evidence, specifically saliva from a crime scene, was linked to a similar attempted murder in Louisiana. The key link was eventually made to Danny Rolling after he was arrested for a minor robbery in Gainesville following the murders. His DNA was taken and matched the evidence from the crime scenes. Rolling was eventually convicted of the 5 murders in 1994, where he shocked the courtroom by pleading guilty and stating, "There are some things you just don't apologize for. I'm sorry that I hurt my family, but I'm not sorry for what I did." He was executed by lethal injection in 2006. The Gainesville Ripper case serves as a dark cautionary tale about the vulnerability of college towns and the catastrophic fear a single individual can inflict on a large, seemingly secure community. The methodical brutality and the staging of the bodies show the killer's psychological drive for control and spectacle. These cases, Zodiac, Little, and Rolling, demonstrate the evolution of the American serial killer from the local, confined predator to the highly mobile, anonymous threat, and the lasting scars they leave on the national psyche. The next section will shift focus to the female serial killer, a statistically rare but equally complex and terrifying phenomenon, and those who operated in professional positions that afforded them unique access to their victims.
These cases, Zodiac, Little, and Rolling, demonstrate the evolution of the American serial killer from the local, confined predator to the highly mobile, anonymous threat, and the lasting scars they leave on the national psyche. The next section will shift focus to the female serial killer, a statistically rare but equally complex and terrifying phenomenon, and those who operated in professional positions that afforded them unique access to their victims. The perception of a serial killer is overwhelmingly male, which is statistically accurate. However, the female serial killer, though less common, presents a unique and often chilling dynamic, frequently exploiting the vulnerability inherent in relationships, caretaking, or cohabitation. One of the most infamous examples is Aileen Wuornos, who became a cultural touchstone representing the stark reality of the female killer who murders for material gain and out of perceived necessity. Aileen Wuornos murdered 7 men in Florida between 1989 and 1990. Unlike the premeditated, ritualistic nature of many male killers, Wuornos' spree was often characterized by robbery and self-defense, though the lines between the two became increasingly blurred. Wuornos was a sex worker who lived a transient life on the highways of Central Florida. She picked up her victims, almost always on the highway, and typically shot them during altercations that occurred after sex. Her first confirmed victim was Richard Mallory in 1989. Wuornos claimed he had raped her and she killed him in self-defense, a claim that was intensely debated during her trial. As the murders continued, committed over a year, the pattern became clear. Older men, isolated locations, and a consistent method of shooting, often with a large caliber weapon. The investigation was complex because the victims were geographically disparate, and Wuornos' motive was often mixed, part financial, part reactive violence. The case was ultimately broken by the recovery of vehicles belonging to the victims, which were traced back to Wuornos and her longtime girlfriend, Tyria Moore. Moore eventually cooperated with police, recording conversations that implicated Wuornos in the murders. The trial of Aileen Wuornos was a media circus. Her troubled background, history of abuse, and the sensational nature of the crimes fueled an intense public fascination. She was convicted and sentenced to death for 6 of the murders. She was executed in 2002. The Wuornos case is critical because it challenges the narrative of the thrill-seeking, purely sadistic killer. Her crimes were born out of desperation, a desire for revenge against men she felt had victimized her, and a need for survival. Yet the sheer number of victims and the cold-blooded nature of the later murders confirm her status as a serial killer driven by a lethal combination of rage, survival, and greed. The female serial killer often operates in a position that allows invisible killing, such as healthcare. This brings us to a more recent and profoundly disturbing case, Charles Cullen, the Angel of Death. Though male, his method of operation is characteristic of the trust exploited by both male and female caretakers, making his story a crucial study in the abuse of professional authority. Charles Cullen was a registered nurse who worked at multiple hospitals and nursing homes in New Jersey and Pennsylvania over 16 years, from 1988 to 2003. He exploited the ultimate position of trust, caring for the sick and vulnerable, to murder his patients by administering lethal doses of common drugs such as digoxin or insulin. Cullen's confirmed victim count is 29, but he claimed in his confession to have murdered as many as 400 patients. Investigators believe the true number may be closer to 400, making him potentially one of the deadliest killers in American history. The true tally is impossible to know, as many of his victims were elderly or critically ill, and their deaths were often attributed to natural causes or unavoidable medical complications. Cullen's ability to move from job to job, despite numerous internal investigations and suspicious incidents, is a harrowing indictment of the hospital systems he worked for. He was often fired or forced to resign from facilities for medication errors or suspicious behaviors, but because these institutions feared legal liability, they rarely reported his conduct to law enforcement or state nursing boards. This culture of silence allowed Cullen to simply walk across the street and find a new job, gaining access to more vulnerable patients. His pattern of killing was insidious. He targeted patients who were critically ill, administering lethal injections when they were least expected to recover. His motive, according to his own statements, was a perverse form of mercy to end their suffering, though prosecutors and criminologists largely dismiss this, viewing his actions as driven by a compulsive need for control and a sense of power over life and death.
The patterns of violence are clear. Exploitation of vulnerability, a powerful need for control, and a chilling ability to hide in plain sight. We must now turn our attention to the killers who created a truly national theater of fear, those who operated as teams or pairs, amplifying the terror with coordinated brutality. When 2 individuals share a murderous fantasy, the resulting violence can be exponentially more destructive and psychologically complex. We begin with the story of Dean Corll, often referred to as the Candyman, and his 2 young accomplices, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley. Corll's crimes, committed in the Houston, Texas area during the early 1970s, are statistically among the most horrific in U.S. history, with a confirmed victim count of at least 28 young men and boys. Corll was an electrician who inherited a candy factory, earning him his grim nickname. He used this veneer of respectability to lure his victims, often offering rides or small amounts of money. However, what made his operation particularly deadly was the involvement of Brooks and Henley, 2 teenagers who helped him recruit and abduct victims in exchange for money, drugs, or protection. Corll was a sadistic killer driven by a profound need for sexual control and torture. The victims, primarily boys between the ages of 13 and 20, were lured to Corll's home, where they were tortured, sexually abused, and ultimately murdered.
The bodies were often buried in rented boat stalls or hidden in the woods, the disposal facilitated by the active assistance of the two accomplices. The horror of the Houston mass murders finally came to light in August 1973 when Elmer Wayne Henley, then 16, shot and killed Coral. Henley claimed he acted in self-defense after Coral threatened him and tried to kill another victim. Following the shooting, Henley confessed to the police, leading them to the gruesome discovery of the mass graves. The sheer scale of the discovery, 27 bodies recovered from 3 separate locations, shocked the nation. It exposed a level of sustained, hidden violence within a large American city that was unprecedented. The case of Dean Coral is not just about his own pathology, but about the failure of the community to see the danger and the chilling ease with which he coerced young, vulnerable individuals to participate in his atrocities. Coral's operation stands as a brutal reminder of the unique dangers posed by codependent killer teams, where one person's fantasy is brought to life through the cooperation of others. The concept of a shared fantasy taken to its most brutal extreme defines the next pair, the Hillside Stranglers, a name initially given to a single killer operating in Los Angeles in the late 1970s, but which was eventually revealed to be 2 men, cousins Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono, Jr. From late 1977 to early 1979, 10 young women and girls were abducted, tortured, and murdered in Los Angeles. The name Hillside Strangler arose because the bodies, many showing signs of rape and prolonged torture, were often discovered on the hillsides surrounding the city. The victims came from varied backgrounds, from students to sex workers, and the methods seemed inconsistent at first. The investigation was hampered by the sheer volume of attacks and the initial belief that they were hunting a single, well-organized perpetrator. The fact that the killer was attacking different demographics led to confusing psychological profiles. The pattern was broken when Kenneth Bianchi moved to Bellingham, Washington in 1979 and immediately began a similar series of abductions and murders. When he was arrested for the Washington crimes, investigators began to question him about the Los Angeles murders. Bianchi, a former security guard who possessed some knowledge of police procedure, initially tried to mislead authorities, attempting to feign multiple personality disorder. However, during interrogation, Bianchi cracked and confessed not only to his own crimes, but also implicating his cousin, Angelo Buono, Jr., in the Los Angeles murders. The cousins had worked together, cruising the streets, impersonating police officers using a fake badge, and luring victims into Buono's car. They used the shared experience to fuel a dark symbiotic relationship of domination and violence. Buono's trial in the early 1980s was one of the longest and most expensive in California history. He was ultimately convicted on 9 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Bianchi pleaded guilty to 5 of the Hillside Strangler murders in California and the 2 murders in Washington, receiving a life sentence. The Hillside Stranglers case fundamentally altered the way law enforcement viewed serial murder, highlighting the complexity of cases involving co-conspirators. The shared dynamic allowed them to escalate their brutality and cover a wider geographic and demographic range than a single killer might attempt. It exposed the danger of not considering the possibility of more than one perpetrator, especially when the crime pattern appears initially inconsistent. The final duo we examine brought an unprecedented level of fear to the entire Washington, D.C. area, proving that a roving team, operating under the cloak of anonymity and distance, could hold an entire metropolitan area hostage. This is the case of the D.C. Snipers, John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo. In October 2002, the Washington, D.C. Beltway area, encompassing D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, was paralyzed by a series of random, high-profile shootings. Over 3 weeks, 10 people were killed and 3 critically wounded.
The victims were diverse: a gardener, a cab driver, a student, a woman loading packages, and a man pumping gas. What terrified the public was the method. The victims were shot at long range, often with a single bullet, with no apparent connection between the victims and no discernible motive. The attacks were impossible to predict, occurring at gas stations, outside schools, and in parking lots. People were terrified to walk outside, pump gas, or simply live their normal lives. The region was gripped by mass panic, shutting down public events and changing routine habits overnight. The investigation was a frantic, multi-jurisdictional effort. The breakthrough came when the killers began leaving cryptic notes at the scenes, demanding money and threatening to kill children. One of the notes mentioned a previous shooting in Tacoma, Washington, which allowed the FBI to connect the D.C. shootings to John Allen Muhammad and his young accomplice, Lee Boyd Malvo. The killers had ingeniously modified the trunk of an old Chevrolet Caprice, creating a sniper's perch through a small hole. This setup allowed them to shoot from inside the car and quickly drive away, baffling investigators for weeks as to the origin of the shots. Muhammad and Malvo were finally arrested when they were discovered sleeping in their car at a rest stop in Maryland, after a truck driver spotted the vehicle and recognized the license plate. The rifle used in the killings was found inside the car. The trial revealed that the killings were part of a delusional plot by Muhammad to extort money and possibly to murder his ex-wife and regain custody of his children. Malvo, then a teenager, had been heavily influenced and manipulated by the older Muhammad, who had essentially groomed him into a killer. Muhammad was executed in 2009. Malvo, due to his age at the time of the crimes, was sentenced to life without parole. The D.C. sniper case represents the height of modern random terror, demonstrating how the combination of skill, mobility, and the sheer unpredictability of target selection can bring a massive modern metropolis to its knees. The journey through the darkest corners of American crime reveals a terrifying, evolving truth. Serial killers are not relics of the past. They are manifestations of societal failures, psychological voids, and the enduring human capacity for monstrous acts. From the meticulous planning of Ted Bundy to the profound indifference of Gary Ridgway, from the communicative arrogance of Zodiac to the institutional exploitation of Charles Cullen, the stories are separated by decades and geography, but united by a single terrifying thread: the absolute destruction of trust. The American landscape, with its vast highways, anonymity in cities, and institutional vulnerabilities, has historically provided a fertile ground for these predators. Their survival depended on social camouflage, the marginalization of their victims, and the slow coordination of justice.
Today, law enforcement is better equipped than ever. Advances in DNA forensics, familial searching, cold case task forces, and national databases like VICAP have radically shifted the odds, making it exponentially harder for a killer to operate undetected for long periods. The capture of the grim sleeper, the identification of Samuel Little, and the decades-late solving of the BTK case stand as testaments to the power of forensic persistence and technological evolution. Yet the danger remains. The most potent lesson gleaned from these horrific histories is the necessity of eternal vigilance. We must acknowledge that the most dangerous evil does not always approach with a menacing snarl. Often it smiles, it offers help, it wears a uniform, or it simply blends into the neighborhood. The memory of the victims, those thousands of lives extinguished by these predators, demands that we understand this reality. Their stories are not merely a chronicle of fear, but a mandate for vigilance, empathy, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The shadows of America's most dangerous serial killers may stretch across our history, but by facing their darkness, we ensure that their terror can never truly prevail.
The net finally closed on Cullen in 2003 when his colleagues at Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey noticed suspicious activity on his patient records. A tenacious investigation by state police, working closely with a fellow nurse, Amy Lowren, who risked her own safety to gather evidence, finally led to his arrest. Cullen's confession was meticulously detailed, but his chilling lack of remorse highlighted the profound disconnect between his quiet, unassuming demeanor and his horrific actions. He was sentenced to 18 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he will never be eligible for parole. The Charles Cullen case did not just capture a killer, it exposed the systematic negligence and fear of litigation within the U.S. healthcare system that allowed a dangerous individual to flourish. His story remains a powerful reminder of how vulnerability, particularly in institutional settings, can be fatally exploited. The final category of danger we examine involves killers who operated in the public eye but hid their monstrous nature behind a veil of respectability, often preying on local populations over an extended period. We look now at the case of Lonnie David Franklin Jr., the Grim Sleeper, a killer who terrified South Los Angeles for decades, exploiting a specific community and the devastating slowness of justice. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was responsible for at least 10 murders and 1 attempted murder in Los Angeles County, spanning from 1985 to 2007. He was dubbed the Grim Sleeper because of a mysterious gap in his killing spree from 1988 to 2002, though some investigators believe his violence continued during this period, with some crimes simply not being linked. Franklin, like Ridgway, targeted vulnerable women, primarily black women who were often involved in sex work or drug abuse in the South Central and later the South Los Angeles areas. He would lure them into his car, sexually assault them, and then shoot them, often dumping their bodies in alleyways and trash bins. Franklin had the ultimate camouflage. He was a former sanitation worker for the city of Los Angeles and a mechanic for the Los Angeles Police Department's motor pool, living an ordinary life in the very community he terrorized. He was a father and husband, and his crimes, like those of Ridgway, were often overlooked by a police system that was slow to connect the disappearances and deaths of marginalized women. The case remained cold for decades, fueled by frustration and a growing sense of abandonment among the victims' families and the community. The breakthrough finally came in 2010, thanks to a revolutionary new forensic technique, familial DNA searching. The police ran the killer's DNA, which had been collected at various crime scenes over 20 years, through the state's DNA database. They found a partial match to Franklin's son, who had a felony conviction. This match suggested that the killer was a close biological relative of the son. Then, investigators put Lonnie Franklin Jr. under surveillance. An undercover officer posed as a waiter at a pizza restaurant where Franklin was dining and collected DNA from discarded pizza crusts and napkins. The DNA from the trash conclusively matched the crime scene. After 25 years, the Grim Sleeper was finally identified. His home contained a horrifying trove of evidence, hundreds of photographs of women, many of whom were unidentified, and weapons that matched those used in the crimes. He was convicted of 10 counts of murder in 2016 and sentenced to death. He died in prison in 2020. The story of the Grim Sleeper is a sobering narrative of how systemic bias and indifference can allow a killer to operate with impunity for decades, transforming a vibrant community into a hunting ground. The use of familial DNA, a controversial but ultimately crucial tool in this case, demonstrates the cutting edge of forensic science that is now essential in confronting these cold, decades-old crimes. The patterns of violence are clear: exploitation of vulnerability, a powerful need for control, and a chilling ability to hide in plain sight. We must now turn our attention to the killers who created a truly national theater of fear, those who operated as teams or pairs, amplifying the terror with coordinated brutality.